Well, it's time to move on and start thinking on making an out-of-the-box directives. I mean, look at this directive. I have created 3 instances of the employee card, all are having the same data, same employee name, right? And if I click on follow button, I'm following all of the employees' directive. Not useful. So why is it happening? Because they're sharing the same scope. So when we create a directive and we don't define the scope object in directives definition, by default, it inherits from the parent scope. So this scope object has been used by all of these directives because they are the child of this controller. Let me show you how. So first, I'm going to remove all of the other employee card directives from here and I'll keep one. So I'm going to log the scope of my parent controller and then the scope here inside my directives controller function. Let's refresh. Expand the main controller scope object. You can see it's having the ID of 2. And my controller scope object is also having an ID of 2. So you can see they are the same scope object, but my directive can have something called a scope attribute, which can take 3 different values. One is false, and that's the default value. So if I use the false value, I'm going to get the same scope object from the parent controller. So say suppose I define new property, say title, on scope object here inside the directives controller's scope object and refresh. It can be seen in parent scope as well as on the child scope. So they are the same object. The other value is true. That means I'm still inheriting from the parent controller scope object, but I'm going to have my own existence. That means we are creating a new scope object for a directive, inheriting all of the properties and behaviors from parent scope. So if I refresh now, you can see my main scope ID is 2 and directive scope ID is 3. Great. And you can see the title property doesn't exist on my parent scope. It's only available inside my directive scope object. But I'm still getting the employee data from parent scope. So if I expand this proto object here inside my directive scope, you can see I have access to the employee object. And we can even have separate scope object. I mean no prototypical inheritance by creating and assigning a completely new object to the scope attribute. So this time, if I refresh, you can see we are having separate scope object. But our directive is also completely empty. Because if I expand this proto object, you can see we don't have access to the employee object. And that's why we don't have anything here on the view. That's called isolated scope. So to make my directive work, I have to redefine my employee object here inside my directive. So if I copy employee object from parent scope to directive scope object, refresh, there we go. The view looks fine now, as we got the employee object defined on our directive scope. So in summary, scope having a value of false, same scope as parent scope. Scope having a value of true, different scope object, but child scope of directive has access to the data and behaviors of parent scope. Isolated scope using object literal, completely different scope, no inheritance. I think this clears the misunderstood concept of directive scope object and made it understood.